Hey again, everyone, and welcome back to Econ once more, microeconomics. Um, Good to see everyone back. I always feel compelled to say something when these things start. But, since I can't really see you, I could say I guess it's good to see me, right? Because that's all I can see is my own self. But before we get into that, I will tell you too, I'm very sleepy because I didn't get a lot of sleep last night. My sweet puppy kept waking me up during the night, so forgive me for being a little loopy, but we have some great stuff for you. We're going to go over minimum wage, we're going to go over labor unions, and that's it for tonight. So that shouldn't be, that shouldn't be that long, and then we can get back to whatever it is we'd rather be doing, right? For me, actually, I'd rather be doing this because I love teaching you guys economics. It's my heart's desire. So I hope that you're enjoying it as much as I am. So without further ado, let's go to our good old whiteboard and we shall begin. Okay, so let's start with the minimum wage. So the minimum wage, everyone's familiar with that issue, and it's been kind of a hot button issue in the last few years. People are talking about raising it, but the minimum wage is simply, it's the same thing as a price floor, okay? What we mean by that, but it's in the resource market. Now, we've been talking about the resource markets and how it's different, the demand and the supply, but let's look at what that means for this. Okay, so we have your handy dandy graph. With that, we will have, for the labor market graph, we've got wages right there and quantity of labor right there. So your wages and your quantity of labor. And you will have a demand, there we go, and a supply of labor. Remember, let's see, let's do it differently. Let's keep ourselves straight. So you have a demand for labor and a supply. That's a little neat. That's what happens when you get lazy. You get messy looking letters. Okay, so we have a demand and supply. And don't forget that that we are the suppliers in that case, the consumers, the households, and then businesses are the demanders. So if you look, we have right here, there's where they intersect, and you have your equilibrium wage rate. Let's put that right there. There we go. Let's do a capital W for that. It's lowercase, but we'll do capital. And we're not going to worry about the quantity right yet because we're talking about wages. Okay, so we're just going to focus on one thing at a time. So wages right here. So what you're saying with the minimum wage, so for this job, for this particular job that we're looking at, this is right here, this is our equilibrium wage rate. All right, and that may be, all right, minimum wage is what, $7.35-ish at the time of this recording. So let's say $7 just to be safe, or $7.50. So let's say what we're saying right here is that equilibrium wage rate for that particular job may have been $5, or it may have been $4, something like that might have been where supply and demand intersect. Instead, we are saying that, or what is being said is that that's not enough money, so we want to make more. We think this job should be paid more for whatever reason. So we're going to put wage, the equilibrium wage, right up here instead. And it's going to look something like this. All right, so there's how it's drawn. And then you're going to, so here is, so that is going to be right there. So here's the problem with that. Okay, let me back up for just a second. So that's what it looks like. Looks like this right here. And see, it's above equilibrium. And I should have went with a different color for that, but you can see what I mean. So it's above equilibrium. So right here, this point, therefore, becomes your quantity demanded of labor right there. Now right here, on the other hand, you have your quantity supplied of labor. All right. Now you see the difference between those two. You have quantity supplied of labor greater than quantity demanded of labor. So yeah, at that, oh, the greater than sign didn't work, did it? Okay. So let's scratch that. Let's write this in. I must have hit the wrong key. Okay. So let's write this again. You've got quantity supplied of labor greater than, I get what it was. I did not use the shift. Sorry about that, folks. Quantity supplied of labor. There we go. Quantity demanded of labor greater than quantity. Oh, goodness gracious, look at me. I did again. Y'all are getting a big laugh at me right now, aren't you? And it's well deserved, I imagine. Okay, so let's do this. All right, so I'm going to mark the out. I'm going to get this right. It kills me, right? And I'm going to tell my dear dog, who has been keeping me up all night, that tonight I do need sleep, right? Because this is what happens when someone doesn't get sleep. So we have quantity supplied of labor greater than quantity demanded of labor. There we go. Now that looks right, doesn't it? All right. So you knew we'd get there, so we're going to get there. Okay, so we've got our quantity supplied of labor greater than quantity demanded of labor. And just as a side note, it went through my mind, the thought ran through my mind that I could stop this and delete this recording and start over. I figured, you know, what the heck, you guys could use a good laugh, right? So here it is. That is my gift to you for whatever the closest holiday is. Enjoy. Okay, perhaps April Fool's Day might be good. So we might want to play this again on April Fool's. This is an early one for me, or, you know, whatever, a late one, or whatever day it is. But anyway. Okay, so we've got quantity supplied. Well, yes, if the price of labor is above equilibrium, of course you're going to have a lot of people who are going to be willing to work for that. Much less, but here's the issue here. Businesses have a labor budget. So they have an amount that they can spend on labor. Now, if they spend more than their budgeted amount, they're not going to make any money. Here's the problem that we're running into here. Just because businesses are paying people more money does not mean that people are buying more products. So their demand has not gone up. So they can't necessarily allocate more money to labor, at least not right away, because what's being talked about is taking the minimum wage from around $7 an hour to around $15 an hour. Now think about it. That means that the businesses are going to be doubling their labor costs right in one fell swoop, just right there. They're going to double their labor costs. That is a bitter pill to swallow. Now, can they raise prices to cover it? Perhaps so. You know, you might think part of it will depend on if the goods that they're providing are elastic or inelastic. They'll have to answer that question. It would depend a lot on the goods involved or the services. But, you know, when we're talking about can they raise the prices, but at least they can at first, and not to cover double the amount of what they're normally paying for labor. Now, when we think about the minimum wage, we think about huge corporations, and a lot of people think, well, you know, they can afford it. I'm not going to feel bad for them. They can afford it. But you don't realize that there's a very small amount of our business community are these large corporations. In fact, it's like around 10 to 12% are large corporations, maybe a little bit more than that. I haven't checked my numbers recently, but it's not as much as you would think. So the majority of people, this is going to be hurting are small businesses. And also consider this. You think about a company like McDonald's. Whenever people talk about the minimum wage, they immediately default to flipping burgers because that's what they think. Well, think about McDonald's for a minute. McDonald's is a corporation, yes, but the individual stores are owned by franchisees, and they are operated like small businesses. So therefore, if you are thinking about McDonald's as a large corporation, this is actually going to hurt the small businesses, the franchisees part. They're operated like small businesses. So you can't take everything as, you know, as it's not that simple, in other words. So we're thinking about that. Let's think about that for a moment. And you see that, yes, their demand, they have to lower their quantity demanded. So what you're going to be left with here, and let's see if I can draw this. Oh, that one, can't make too much fun of me. My bracket looked okay, and it's never been great to start with, so that's pretty good. So what you get here is a surplus. All right, so you have a surplus of labor there. That means people out of work. So if minimum wage is raised, people are going to be out of work, and eventually the prices will have to come up. Okay, eventually they will have to raise prices to cover that. So for businesses, let's look at something else here. Businesses, when wages increasing wages lead to increasing variable costs, but price, and therefore, don't worry, I'm going to stop in a minute to catch up. Total revenue remain constant. All right, so businesses, increasing wages leads to increasing variable costs, but price and total revenue remain constant. So what you've got here, let's look. So you've got total revenue minus total costs, and let's say total costs are your fixed costs plus your variable costs, and that equals profit. And I haven't found the symbol typing for pi yet, so I'm not going to draw it. I'm just going to do that. So we've got your variable cost, that's your labor, so it's going up. And so that means that this whole thing, but total revenue is not going up. So profit, therefore, would be going down. So you've got your variable costs decreasing. You've got total revenue staying constant. And so that means this whole the equation is decreasing, therefore, so is the profit for businesses. That's good. And if you think that's not going to bother them, yes, it is. And we're not talking about being greedy. We're talking about staying in business. Because think about it, it's the small and mid-sized businesses that are going to be affected the most. Now, government intervention of this sort and I'm going to stop and talk to you for a minute with that. All right. Government intervention of this sort, it began in 1930. Okay, so it started around the Great Depression, and that was part of the government intervention that was trying to help people out. It did not help people out, okay? And it was never meant to be permanent either. It was meant to be temporary, just to kind of help things along, get us over the Great Depression, get people with a living wage. I don't think it's a great idea then, but it's what they did. You know, it's history. It's over water under the bridge. What happened when that started was that unemployment went up to double digits. Now, here's something interesting about this minimum wage thing going on here. Unemployment, when the Great Depression hit, unemployment went up. It only went up to about 9 or 10%. It never got that high. Now, this is in 1929. Okay, by June of 1930, so right at a year, a little bit less than a year later, what happened is the unemployment rate already decreased back down to a little over 6%. So we're close to full employment there, because full employment is 4 to 6% unemployment rate. That's what we consider normal. So it had already started to correct itself. But we're running into the same problem as what we ran into with our Great Recession, is just the recovery. So even if you're starting to make inroads up, having, if it's going to be a long, drawn-out, hard recovery, then you know, it's going to feel worse than it is. So that's going to be not a great thing. So then the more they tinkered with it, so they kept tinkering with the minimum wage, and every time they do, unemployment goes up. In fact, it was the top during the Roosevelt administration at 25%. So that's just some interesting data that people don't usually like to talk about at parties when they're complaining about things. So when the minimum wage goes up, it leads to higher unemployment because of that surplus of labor. All right. With that being said, let's talk about labor unions. What they do for us. All right, so Labor union is a group of workers who join together to improve working conditions. And of course, the larger the group, the greater the influence they may have. So in the past, when labor unions were started, it was when working conditions were really, really bad and workers were kind of, or they seemed uneducated and unsophisticated, and they were not able to really convince the business owners to give them these better conditions. So that they came about at a time when things might have been bad for the American workers. However, they've morphed into something else over the years that is not exactly great for the economy. So how they do this, how they improve working conditions, is one thing. They do something called collective bargaining. And collective bargaining, this is simply a fancy word for contract negotiations. All right? So contract negotiations. Now, if the contract negotiations, one way they might do that is to submit something called binding arbitration. And if you've had any legal classes or something, you may have seen this. So this is something they would do as part of their collective bargaining, or if they're not coming to agreement. And what this is accepting the decision of an impartial third party, which is called a mediator. So you hear about that in legal civil cases and things like that. You might hear about some binding arbitration. If they cannot come to an agreement, then what's next is the workers may go on strike. And when they go on strike, that is when they refuse to work until the firm accepts their terms. Okay, so that's a strike. And that's the last resort because the workers do not get paid during a strike. All right, so how this looks, let's erase this. I'm going to give myself plenty of room. So it looks like this. We looked at graphs 4 of the labor market for the industry and the firm. So let's draw those graphs again. Oh, all right. Got a little crooked there, but hey, it will still do the job. And then we've got our demand and our supply. So that's the industry. Now let's get over here and draw the firm. That I did a little better, didn't it? It only curved up at the end. Now the firm is different. All right, the firm strictly has a demand curve. So let's go back and label all of this. So we'll put a W for wages. I'm going to put quantity of labor, but again, we're going to focus strictly on the wages right there. Wages and quantity of labor right there. All right, so here we have our demand for labor, our supply of labor, and here again, this is the firm's demand for labor. All right, so now we've got everything all labeled except for equilibrium wage. So let's put it right here. Oh, there we go. Get my little. All right, so there we go. And we've got equilibrium wage right there. All right, so let's take this across. Let's take this across to the firm. All right, so we're going to take it across to the firm. Now we're going to worry about quantity over here. This is what the firm can buy at that wage. Okay, so we've got some quantity of labor right here. The quantity demanded of labor at the equilibrium wage. So I'll put a star there for the equilibrium wage, and let's put that right there. Okay, there we go. All right, so that's what the firms looks like. Now they just have a demand curve because their supply of labor, that's coming from the market. So whoever is going to work for them at this wage, this is the amount they're going to hire. So they don't really need a supply curve. The supply curve, in other words, could be, wage and so on. So that it's some combination thereof. So quantity demanded of labor, that's what they can afford. Now, again, the labor union is saying, okay, equilibrium wage is not that great. equilibrium wage is not enough, and by golly, we're not going to work for it. So their contract negotiations, they come up with a union wage. So we're going to put that as for the U there, for the union wage. So let's put it here. All right, and we're going to carry it on across to the front and make our little dot there. All right, so right here, let's put it again, W union. There we go. Okay. Now at that, they're going to have, this is the quantity of labor for the union wage. This is all they can afford. See, it's less. You can see that it's less, and this is all they can afford because like we were saying, we'll just put a U there for union. So the quantity demanded for union. Now, like we were saying, they have a limited budget and they can only afford to pay what's their demand. So here it is. And obviously, when it's a higher wage, it's going to take up more of their money. So they have less. Okay, so they have less rather. They demand less labor. All right, so normally we would call this, we would say it's a surplus, wouldn't we? Normally we would just say that there is a surplus because yes, there's plenty of union workers that would want to work for this wage, but it depends on what the firm can afford to pay. And the firm cannot afford to pay as much. So they have a surplus of labor. So right now we could stop right there except for one tiny, tiny little thing. And I'm being sarcastic when I say it's not tiny at all. So what the union will therefore put into the contract, they know how this works. They have economists that work for them too. They know how this works. So what they put into the contract is a practice called feather bedding. And feather bedding is that the union contract requires firms to hire a certain number of people. All right, so feather bedding, they're telling them, nope, you have to hire a certain number of people or we're not going to send any workers your way. And some places they like, fine, we'll just go hire other non-union workers. Some places though, the workers are skilled, like for example, the auto workers, they have the firms really don't have a lot of choice. So what they end up with there is, so they have to hire, let's say right here is where they hire. And come back down here. All right, so that's where they want them to go. So this is the feather bedding quantity. So let's do quantity demanded. And we'll do an F for feather bedding. F could stand for something else for the company, couldn't it? But I did not just say that. Okay, yes, I did. I guess it's recorded. Okay, so for frivolous, get your mind away from there. For frivolous, okay, or F for feather bedding. Right, okay, let's go back to that. Okay, so here you are. So what they're doing now right here is the problem with this, okay? There is a problem with this. So here's the problem. Is that their demand for labor does not shift right, which means it does not increase. Let me write this differently for you. So it does not increase, and we'll put shift right. There we go. So it does not increase or shift right because there is no extra product demand. Okay, now there's the problem, right? If there were extra demand for products, if they were selling more products, then they would have a new demand curve right there. If they were selling more products, now remember that concept. This goes back to that concept of derived demand. So if they were selling more products, then that would mean that would shift the labor curve, their demand for labor, this way, to the right. And then, okay, maybe we could work with that, right? Because they're selling products, but there's no extra product demand. So derived demand comes into play, and they can't sell enough products to cover paying for these. So they have to come up with something else. They have to raise prices. They have to, figure out what they're doing. But according to the theory, which is accurate, completely and totally accurate, of derived demand, this is not going to make sense for the firm. So what you have here, let's write it down for you. This forces firms to produce outside their demand curve. And then over here, I'm going to put no, all right, I'm going to put member derived. All right, so remember your derived demand. So this forces firms to produce outside their demand curve. This is artificial demand, which is not optimal. The demand for labor, I'm writing this over and over again so it'll sink in, right, is derived from the demand for products it produces. Okay, so demand for labor is derived from the demand for products it produces. So this demand curve right here, this is artificial and it's not optimal. So they've got a higher wage producing outside their demand curve. They're not going to pay people to stand around. And if they do that, quite frankly, the union complains about that as well. Can't cut their hours, can't do any of that. So they put them to work. They build these things that people don't use. And they end up eventually, like in the auto market, they can raise the prices and then they have to lower the prices, right, to get rid of them. So it is not an optimal market, not at all. Look at places that are non-union, they operate. I mean, Tesla, for example, they can't produce theirs fast enough. Tesla has waiting lists 10 miles long and people are bidding, to beat the band to get a Tesla. They're bidding just these crazy astronomical prices to get a Tesla, and they're building, they're not following this typical demand. They're going strictly from their demand for labor is strictly, they only hire enough people to produce what they have orders for. So, maybe there's a better way of doing things, perhaps. But anyway, so you can see the problems there. At one time, perhaps it was needed and necessary. I didn't live during that time. I only go by what I've heard. Right now, it seems like it's just causing all sorts of efficiency problems in the market. But, you may have a different perspective than what I do. So anyway, that is it for tonight. That is all we're going to do. And so I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something, or I hope you confirmed something you already knew. Either way, it's always wonderful to talk with you all. And if you have any questions or comments, feel free to email me, post them to the discussion board, and we'll see you next time.